right, let's dive in. Today's deep dive is a question, and it's one that's always kind of blown my mind.
Okay.
What brought down the British Empire?
Wow.
I mean, think about it. We're talking about a global superpower. 26% of the world's landmass. 412 million people under their rule just a century ago.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people.
That's wild.
It's like 1 in every 4 people on the planet were British subjects.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an empire that really
It's huge.
boggles the mind when you try to wrap your head around it.
It really does.
Yeah.
So how do we even start to think about what brought down an empire of that scale?
Well, I think to understand the fall, we first need to grasp the rise, right? We need to go back and look at England's dominance in the British Isles.
So we're going way back, before the British Empire as we know it officially existed.
Exactly. Think of it like this. King Alfred the Great, back in the 9th century, he was pushing back against Viking incursions and laying the foundation for a unified England. That resilience, that ability to withstand and then absorb external pressure, well, it became a key part of their identity, you know?
So it wasn't just military strength, but also this ability to adapt and consolidate their power over time that set the stage
Precisely.
for global expansion.
Over centuries, England, they navigated a really complex web of relationships with Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, asserting their dominance, but also forging alliances and ultimately this sort of unified identity. And it was this unified force that officially became the British Empire in 1707.
Okay, so we have the stage set for this global empire. But then, just a few decades later, bam, the American Revolution.
Oh.
How did this event lead to the empire's eventual decline? Was it just losing power?
Losing land and resources, but also I think in terms of prestige. It was the first major challenge to British imperial authority,
Yeah.
And it was successful. So I think that reverberated throughout the world.
Yeah, it's like the first crack in a seemingly impenetrable fortress.
Right.
Suddenly everyone else sees that maybe they're not so invincible after all.
Exactly. And it wasn't just demonstrating that vulnerability. It actually gave them a blueprint for how to rebel. The ideals of liberty and self-determination from the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
Well, it inspired other colonies who wanted that freedom too. It was like a spark that ignited this anti-colonial sentiment that was already out there.
The ripple effect of the American Revolution went far beyond just those 13 colonies.
Absolutely.
It really planted the seeds for the future dismantling of the empire.
And the irony is, right, Britain had just won the 7 Years' War against France and Spain. They expanded their empire.
They were on top of the world.
Exactly. Global standing's great, but it came at a cost.
Overstretched resources, I imagine.
Well, yeah, logistical nightmares.
Makes sense.
Totally.
Like winning a pie-eating contest, but then getting such a stomachache that you can't even look at pie for like a week.
That's a perfect analogy. It became so difficult to manage, and all that resentment they built up by increasing taxes and control. Well, it all started to grow. The American Revolution, it was a symptom of this growing tension.
Okay, so you have this brewing sense of internal rebellion. But at the same time, the world is changing too. What were the external pressures that were chipping away at British dominance?
Well, during the 19th century, we saw the rise of these new global players who were challenging Britain both economically and militarily. Germany unified under Bismarck,
Right.
and the United States economy grew at an incredible rate. Those were game changers.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about keeping control of their existing colonies. Now they had to deal with these new powerhouses on the world stage.
Exactly.
Talk about pressure.
Yeah, and that pressure wasn't just from the outside. Losing the American colonies and the unrest in other territories, it forced the British to really rethink their whole strategy.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, they tightened their control,
To prevent further losses.
Exactly. But a lot of times that had the opposite effect. It just fueled more resentment and pushed more territories toward independence.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to maintain control with all this pressure.
And then, of course, you have the world wars.
Right.
They completely reshaped the global landscape. How did those wars further speed up the decline of the British Empire?
The world wars, they were devastating for everyone, but they really highlighted how vulnerable the British Empire was. World War I, they won,
Right.
but it left them economically drained. The cost of maintaining this huge empire, well, it became a burden. Their global influence was shrinking.
It seems like World War I marked a turning point.
Yeah.
Like the cracks that had been forming for years, they were suddenly exposed.
Exactly.
And then World War II probably delivered the knockout blow.
Yeah, it was crucial that they won to preserve democracy.
Absolutely.
But it came at a huge cost. The colonies were vital to the war effort. But the conflict also showed the limits of their military, how much they could actually defend this massive overseas empire.
So it sounds like the wars were catalysts. They sped up a process that was already happening.
Yes.
But before we get to the final chapters of the British Empire, I want to understand more about these new players that emerged in the 19th century, starting with Germany. What made them such a powerful challenger to the British?
Bismarck, he was a genius. He unified the German states and then harnessed their industrial and military potential.
Wow.
Germany transformed into this economic and military powerhouse. They were directly challenging Britain's long-held dominance in Europe. It was a huge shift.
So they were a direct threat to the heart of British power.
Definitely.
And the scramble for colonies in Africa and Asia.
Oh, yeah, that just intensified the rivalry.
Made everything worse.
Yeah, it became this competition for resources, markets, and global influence. And let's not forget about the United States.
Right, they're a former colony. It's incredible that the United States, which was literally born from rebelling against the British, would eventually surpass them
I know, right? It's wild.
as a global economic power.
Yeah, their growth during the 19th century was amazing. Industrialization, innovation, westward expansion. Their economy just eclipsed Britain's.
So the student surpassed the teacher, so to speak. Was that a wake-up call for the British? Did they realize their days as the only global superpower were numbered?
I think they were becoming aware that the world was changing, but recognizing the change and actually accepting it.
Totally different.
Totally different things. The British Empire, with all its history and traditions, they were slow to adapt to this new reality.
It's like they were clinging to the past,
Yeah.
unwilling to accept that their time was over.
It's almost like...
But as we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive, trying to hold on, well,
Yeah.
it just wasn't going to work.
No, the forces of history were moving against them.
And there's nothing they could do about it. So we've set the stage for the decline of the British Empire. We've seen how internal rebellions, the rise of new global powers, and the impact of the world wars all weakened their grip on the world. But that's not the end of the story. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore the final chapters of this epic saga. We'll look at the events that led to the dismantling of the empire and the rise of the post-colonial world.
Should be fascinating.
It's going to be a great one.
Yeah. Welcome back. When we left off, the British Empire was dealing with a lot of issues. Internal unrest, rising global rivals, and the economic strain of 2 world wars. It's a crazy turning point in history where this giant empire starts to weaken.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me how, even after things like the American Revolution, the British just kept trying to expand their empire, almost like they're trying to make up for what they lost.
Exactly. Take the colonization of Australia in 1788, right? That wasn't just about finding a new penal colony. It was a strategic move to gain a foothold in the Pacific and get access to more resources.
So they were still trying to be a major player on the world stage, even as their position was becoming shaky. But we can't forget about the tensions within the British Isles themselves. What was going on in Ireland during all of this?
Ireland, well, it had been a source of conflict for the British for a really long time. Centuries of English and later British rule had created a lot of resentment and desire for self-rule. Remember those ideas from the American and French revolutions? They were spreading, and they found a receptive audience in Ireland.
So those winds of change were blowing across the Atlantic and reaching Ireland.
Exactly. And in 1798, the Irish Rebellion broke out, inspired partly by those revolutionary ideals. And while it was eventually put down, it showed how deep the grievances were and how fragile British control was, even right in their own backyard.
It's like they were trying to put out a fire in one part of their house, but the embers had already spread somewhere else. But at the same time, they're also dealing with a changing world order. We talked about Germany unifying and the United States on the rise. How did those events directly affect the British Empire?
Germany unifying under Bismarck was a total game changer. They became this massive industrial and military power, challenging Britain's economy and their naval dominance.
So a direct threat to the core of British power, and then trying to grab up colonies in Africa and Asia must have made that rivalry even worse.
Absolutely. It turned into a race for resources, for markets, and for global influence.
Yeah.
And don't forget about the United States, you know?
Right, their former colony.
Yeah.
It's almost poetic that the U.S., which started by rebelling against the British, would eventually overtake them.
Yeah, you could say
That's
that.
the biggest economic power.
It really was phenomenal how quickly they grew in the 19th century. Industrialization, innovation, westward expansion.
And it just never stopped.
Right, they just kept growing, and their economy eventually outdid Britain's.
So the British were getting squeezed from all sides, colonies wanting independence, rivals on the rise, and even a former colony outproducing them. It's like a perfect storm brewing.
And then on top of all that, you've got the World Wars, which exposed the weaknesses of the empire and really sped up its decline.
Let's talk a bit more about the impact of those wars. You mentioned before that World War I was particularly draining for Britain, even though they won. Can you tell us more about that?
Just think about the massive scale of the conflict. Millions of soldiers, tons of resources being used, and their national debt just exploded. Britain won, but it came at a huge cost, both in lives lost and financially.
So they won the war, but were basically exhausted by it. It's like winning a marathon, but collapsing at the finish line.
Exactly, and World War II hit them even harder. They were crucial in defeating Nazi Germany, but it really depleted their resources and showed the limits of their military power.
You mentioned earlier that Japan's advances in Asia during World War II were particularly damaging to British prestige. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, it was humiliating when Japan quickly conquered British colonies like Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. These were important strategic locations, and when they fell, it showed that the British couldn't protect their vast overseas territories anymore.
Those losses must have been really disheartening for the British people back home, and it probably made the desire for independence in their colonies even stronger.
For sure. The idea that Britain was unbeatable, well, that was gone. And after the war, with the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as the new superpowers, Britain found itself pushed aside on the world stage.
The balance of power had completely changed.
Yeah.
So where did that leave the British Empire in this new world? How did they adapt to this new reality?
Well, the post-war era was a time of huge change for the British Empire. The old colonial system was falling apart, and there was a push for independence sweeping through Asia and Africa. These independence movements were gaining strength, fueled by the ideas of self-determination and the realization that European dominance was fading.
And this is where we really see the beginning of the end for the British Empire as we knew it, right? The breakup of their colonies and the birth of the post-colonial world.
Exactly. And the independence of India in 1947 was a huge turning point. It was the start of the end for the British Empire.
So what were the main reasons that led to India's independence? It must have been a mix of internal and external factors coming together at the right time.
Yeah, you're right. Decades of growing Indian nationalism, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, put huge pressure on the British to give them independence.
And Gandhi's nonviolent resistance movement was really effective at showing the world that colonial rule was morally wrong, and it rallied millions of Indians to fight for their freedom.
And after World War II, the British Empire was weaker, which made the independence movement even stronger. They didn't have the resources or the will to keep control of India when faced with such widespread resistance.
Plus, with the United States and the Soviet Union becoming superpowers, it would have been hard for Britain to justify holding on to its colonies.
The world had changed, and the old colonial system didn't fit anymore. It was a new era defined by the Cold War.
So the British government, under Clement Attlee, decided to grant independence to India and Pakistan in 1947. A huge turning point, the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in world history.
It was an acknowledgement that things had changed, that the British Empire, as it had been, was no longer sustainable.
But even as the empire was falling apart, a new organization emerged, the Commonwealth of Nations. What was the point of this? Was it just a way for Britain to try to hold on to some of its power and influence?
The Commonwealth of Nations, or the British Commonwealth as it was first called, was meant to maintain ties between Britain and its former colonies, but in a new way, based on equality and cooperation.
So a shift from being controlled to a partnership.
Exactly. It was about encouraging dialogue, promoting democracy and human rights, and working together on issues they all cared about. It was a way for Britain to redefine its role in the world, moving from being dominant to being a partner.
It's a really interesting change, this empire turning into what seems like a much more positive organization. But did it work? Did it actually create real cooperation and equality among its members?
Well, the Commonwealth has a complex legacy. It definitely helped to encourage dialogue and cooperation between its members, But it's also been criticized for not dealing with the effects of colonialism well enough and for allowing neo-colonial relationships to continue.
Almost like trying to build a new house on the foundation of an old one. You can make it look nice, but those old cracks might still be there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The Commonwealth, while aiming for equality and cooperation, still had to deal with the history of the empire, the imbalances of power, and the resentment left over from its colonial past.
So going from empire to commonwealth wasn't a clean break. It was more of a balancing act between old and new, past and present.
Exactly. And this brings up an important question. What is the legacy of the British Empire? How should we view this complicated part of history?
It's a question that historians, politicians, and everyday people are still grappling with. There's no simple answer, because the empire lasted for centuries and affected millions of lives around the world.
You can't ignore the brutality and exploitation that was a big part of British colonial rule. Displacing native populations, taking resources, and suppressing local cultures are all dark parts of the empire's history.
Yeah, there were definitely some terrible things that happened.
Absolutely. But the British Empire also left behind lasting institutions, infrastructure, and cultural exchange. Things like English language, legal systems, and educational models all came from British colonialism, and they still shape the world today.
So it's a mixed bag, some good, some bad, and I guess that makes it hard to categorize.
It's a very complex legacy. We have to acknowledge both the positive and negative sides of the British Empire's impact if we want to understand its lasting influence on the world.
And that's the difficult part, isn't it? To deal with the complexities of history, to see all the different sides, and not try to simplify the past into a good versus evil story.
Exactly. The story of the British Empire is a story of human ambition, ingenuity, cruelty, and resilience. It's a story that still matters today because it teaches us about power, culture, and the effects of colonialism.
And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive into the fall of the British Empire. We've explored how it went from expansion to decline, the effects of rising global rivals and world wars, and the complicated legacy of colonialism. But there's more to discover. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll shift our focus to the human stories, the individual experiences that often get lost in the big historical events. We'll explore how the decline of the British Empire affected different people, from colonial administrators and soldiers to everyday citizens and indigenous populations. Join us next time for a fascinating look at the human cost of empire and the challenges of creating a new world order. Welcome back to our deep dive on the fall of the British Empire. So far, we've talked about the historical stuff and the big global events that led to its decline. But now I want to get a little more personal. What was it actually like to live through all of that? How did people handle all the changes and the collapse of this huge empire?
It's a great question, and one that often gets missed in the big historical narratives. The decline of the British Empire wasn't just some political process. It was real life for millions of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they all had their own experiences and perspectives.
Let's imagine for a second being a British soldier stationed in India during those final days. You spent your life serving the empire, but now you're watching it fall apart right in front of you. What emotions do you think they were going through?
Well, for a lot of those soldiers and civil servants, people who had devoted their careers to the empire, it must have been incredibly disillusioning. They believed in the mission, this idea of a global British empire.
Right.
And to see it crumble, to witness the transfer of power, it must have been really unsettling.
Yeah, unsettling. A sense of loss, confusion, maybe even resentment.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just their professional identity, right? A lot of them had formed strong personal connections to the people and the places where they served.
They built lives there.
Exactly. Imagine having to leave a place you've called home for years, not knowing what the future holds for you or the people you're leaving behind.
That's got to be tough.
Yeah.
On the flip side, you have people like Mahatma Gandhi who fought their whole lives to bring down the empire. What made him so different, so effective?
Gandhi was a remarkable leader. He not only understood and spoke for millions of Indians, but he also gave them a powerful and effective way to resist nonviolent civil disobedience. His approach really highlighted the moral problems of colonial rule.
It forced the British to see the injustice of their actions.
Exactly.
It's incredible how a peaceful movement could take down an empire built on military force.
It really is.
It just shows the power of ideas, of standing up for what you believe in, and the human desire for freedom.
Gandhi's influence went far beyond India, too.
Oh, I'm sure.
His ideas of nonviolent resistance inspired so many other movements around the world.
Yeah, he's an icon.
He showed everyone that ordinary people, with enough courage and conviction, could challenge even the most powerful systems.
So I've talked about those who served the empire and those who fought against it. But what about everyone else caught in the middle? Those ordinary people just trying to live their lives as everything changed around them.
Yeah, it's important to remember that the decline of the British Empire happened alongside other massive shifts in the world.
Like what?
Industrialization, urbanization, technology.
Right, huge changes.
Yeah, they all helped to weaken that old colonial system.
And I'm guessing those changes had a big impact on people's lives, both in Britain and in its former colonies.
Absolutely. Imagine, for example, workers in British factories who suddenly had to compete with cheaper products coming from these newly industrialized countries.
Their jobs were on the line.
Exactly. Or think about the indigenous populations in Africa and Asia.
Mm-hmm.
They were forced to adapt to new economic systems, new social structures, new cultural influences. It was a lot to handle.
It's a good reminder that history is more than just dates and battles and political agreements. It's about people's lives, their hopes and dreams.
Absolutely.
Their struggles and their successes.
It's those individual stories that make history come alive. They connect us to the past on a human level.
Yeah, you can relate to it more.
Exactly. We can understand how complex historical change really is, and we can appreciate how resilient people are.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the fall of the British Empire, what are some of the big takeaways? What lessons can we learn from this complicated and fascinating time in history?
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons is that empires don't last forever.
No matter how powerful.
Right. They're subject to the same forces of change, the same internal issues and external pressures that shape everything else in the world.
It's a reminder that power is never permanent, that even the seemingly strongest things can crumble.
And the fall of the British Empire also shows how important it is to listen to different voices and perspectives, the people who were marginalized and ignored by the empire.
Their voices mattered.
They were crucial in challenging the empire and eventually bringing it down.
It's amazing that change can come from those who are often overlooked.
It really is. And lastly, I think the story of the British Empire reminds us that history isn't just something that happened in the past.
It still affects us today.
Exactly. The impact of colonialism is all around us in the political systems, economies, and cultures of so many countries.
So understanding the past helps us understand the present.
And hopefully helps us build a better future.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fall of the British Empire. We've covered a lot: the historical background, the big events, and the individual stories. But as we've seen, this isn't just about the past. This is a story that still resonates with us today, teaching us about power, culture, and the lasting effects of colonialism.
I encourage everyone to keep learning about this topic, to look at different perspectives, and to think about how the lessons of the past can help us understand the present and create a more just and fair world.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. Thanks for tuning in to this deep dive.